conversation, because that's also the point of the meeting, right? Thank you all for joining tonight. It's really lovely to see you all here. My name is Katie Saunders. I am a consultant with a firm called Makers Architecture and Urban Design. First of all, I am very soft-spoken sometimes, so I'm going to do my best, but just wave or if you're having trouble hearing me at any point. So my firm, Makers, we're working with the city of Anacortes in partnership with Parametrics to put together the first climate element. So we've been working for the past year or so closely with city staff and many members of your wonderful community, and are really excited to present kind of a good bulk of the work that we've done to date. And then I can give you an update on what's to come. The agenda tonight, welcome moment we just had, kind of a milling around. We're going to do a fairly short presentation just to kind of give you an overview of where the overall comprehensive plan process is, where the climate plan element is, and really touch on kind of where we are in the process and what we're sharing tonight. Can I get a quick show of hands? I recognize many of you in the room. Is this our first meeting for anyone here? A few. Okay, so I'll give you an overview of kind of where we've been and how we got to this point, and then if you have any other questions during the open house, happy to kind of answer it and fill in more details. And we have a lot of printed resources on kind of where we've been. For those of you who have been at meetings, this presentation might have some kind of repetitive information, but we'll move through quickly. And then, but the bulk of tonight is really for you to look at the boards, use the stickers, and I'll be giving more directions, but you should all have stickers from checking in. If not, there's more at the front desk. And we're just really asking you to give feedback tonight on what you like, what you'd like to see more of. So we'll get more into the specifics of the feedback at the end of the presentation. First, I'll start with just an overview of the comprehensive plan. So the comprehensive plans are the primary policy document that guides the city or the county's planning over a 20-year period. And the city is in the state of updating their comprehensive plan, and we'll be wrapping that up at the end of this year, 2025. Comprehensive plan is influenced by and reflects community involvement, technical analysis, state and regional requirements, and decision makers. And I just covered the last bullet, but yeah, so we're in part of this every 10-year update is what the city's been really focused on this year. This update is building on the previous much of the work of the previous comprehensive plan. So the vision statement that was developed through that really large process in the earlier is still kind of carrying forward into this. And this is an overall summary of kind of the timeline of where we are. So started in 2024, carrying into 2025. We're in March, so right around here, and gives a sense. So each of the elements has been moving forward at different timelines. So many of them have moved through Planning Commission, and many of you may have attended those meetings. Climate element is about to move into that process, and a few other elements as well. And all of the elements are moving toward into City Council and adoption towards the end of the year. I'm just going to ask John or Libby if I'm missing anything or anything else to touch on in these slides. Do you want to? Oh, here he comes. Perfect.
Hi, I'm John Coleman. I'm the director of the Planning Community and Economic Development Department. Thank you for everybody for being here. I just wanted to, as we're talking about this process, Makers is going to be at our Planning Commission meeting Wednesday, a week from yesterday, to talk about the climate element in detail. So there'll be a large presentation that day, so if you or anybody you know that's interested wants to either attend that, and of course it'll be recorded. So if you have any interest in learning all about the background of the climate element and it just being fed to you in a hour or so presentation, I encourage you to watch that Planning Commission video, which will be available shortly after the meeting, or attend the meeting if you like. And I think that's all I have to say. I want to introduce myself, be sure to say hi afterwards.
And this slide just gives an overview of I mentioned earlier, some of the individual elements of the comprehensive plan have been have drafts available on the city's website. Climate element will be moving through the Planning Commission, and will be information on the website shortly, along with the other elements here: economic development, parks and recreation, and open space, and the environment and conservation elements. All right, so the climate element. This slide provides an overview of the process. Since there are a few of you who are new or haven't been at previous meetings, the climate element is a new requirement set by the state through a law that was passed in 2023 that required all communities in Washington state to plan for climate change through the comprehensive plan process. And there are different requirements depending on where the community is located and the size of the community. For Anacortes, there are two what's called sub-elements in very planner-ease language, which basically just means content sections of the climate element. So there's a greenhouse gas emissions sub-element that's required and a resilience sub-element. So the greenhouse gas emissions sub-element is a process that looks at overall emissions from the community and identifies ways and strategies through goals and policies to reduce those emissions. And we'll be presenting some highlights of the analysis that the team did to meet those requirements for Anacortes. The resilience sub-element is about addressing the impacts of climate change, understanding what the local potential impacts from climate change are in the future and how they're changing, and identifying goals and policies to increase resilience. And this slide kind of gives you an overview of the process that we've gone through. We're at the kind of establishing goals and policies phase. We're merging that a little bit with the plan integration phase, so that those pieces are a little overlapping, more so than maybe this diagram suggests. And what that plan integration phase is climate change is a big topic, and it has there's ways in which it touches many different elements of the comprehensive plan. And so we've working on a draft of list of goals and policies, but many of those are also going to relate to other elements. The boards that we are sharing here tonight kind of reflect that a little bit. You see different categories that aren't just all climate. Some of them are economic development, some of them relate to land use. So we are thinking about and developing goals and policies that are going to be part of the climate element, but also kind of relate to or cross-referenced across the comprehensive plan. So that's what that plan integration phase is. Probably way more detail than you wanted, but that's just what that phase is. So let's talk impacts. The local impacts, and this comes from the analysis that we did in partnership with Parametrics to sort of review local impacts using a range of data, both from the state, UW, a range of data to really understand what are the local potential impacts from climate change. And what really is emerging out of that review is sea level rise and coastal flooding, which I know there's been work that the community's already done to identify that, so not news, but that one is rising to the top. Changes in precipitation as a driver has a lot of kind of secondary impacts or considerations that the city needs to continue or needs to consider in the future. Drought stress, so if we have drier summers, what that might do to local ecosystems. Storms and flooding, if there are heavier rainstorms in the winter months, which is likely, what would that do to potential for storm and flooding? And also the erosion and potential increase in landslide that's associated with that. So all of those are kind of related to that change in precipitation. Heat is another one, extreme heat, and I know Anacortes is wonderfully located in this corner of Washington, not immediately thought of as a major vulnerability to heat, but region-wide and across the state, temperatures are increasing and there is more exposure to heat. And one of the key aspects of extreme heat that's important is that even if temperatures don't get extremely high, a very fast change in temperature can really have impacts on human health, particularly for vulnerable populations. So even if the temperatures aren't as high as you would see in California or extreme other areas, a quick change, and particularly in a region where we don't have a building infrastructure that has a lot of air conditioning or that's acclimated to extreme heat, it can result in significant heat impacts. And so the city, through this process, we've been looking at that and thinking about that. And finally, wildfire. And there's two components of wildfire, and this has really been brought, we've been looking at it, but also was brought by community members that are concerned about this and brought it to meetings in wanting to see some focus on the climate element on this. Two kind of really important aspects of wildfire, both or one being wildfire smoke, which we all have experienced throughout the region. It's coming from even statewide or even international fires. So that exposure to smoke and what it does to a range of populations, vulnerable populations, people who work outside. So considering that. And then also understanding that there is some local wildfire risk. You had a recent fire in 2016, 2017, and just understanding how to plan for that local wildfire risk and make sure that the city and the community is prepared. To share all of the research and information we've done, we have developed a Climate Explorer tool. So on the agendas, you should have a QR code, and this is still live online, so you're welcome to use your phone to explore this or take it home and explore it in more detail. There's a lot more information, both about local impacts as well as the greenhouse gas inventory, which we'll be touching on in a second. So I'm touching on the highlights tonight, but just want you to know you still have access to that web resource and are invited and encouraged really to dig in and check out those details. What's that? I think it can, yes, at anacortes.com, right? Yeah. But also, you don't even have to wait to there. You can just go on the QR code on your agenda as well. So as part of the study of these local impacts, one of the things we've been the team has looking at is what's called assessing local vulnerability. And so vulnerability is really made up of 3 different aspects that are each in turn comprised of lots of individual data points. There's the exposure index, which is just the degree to which the area is exposed to a natural hazard, so exposed to heat, exposed to wildfire, exposed to sea level rise, the degree to which it physically is impacting. Then there's a sensitivity index, and this is an understanding of what the local population is in these areas and how sensitive they may be to local impacts. Age is a key aspect there, health indications, different aspects of how sensitive a local population may be. And then there's the adaptive capacity, which is the ability of the area to adapt to these types of impacts. So pieces of like lower income populations, different things that might make it harder for a local community to adapt to those type of impacts. So there's both sensitivity, which relates to health, and then there's the ability to adapt, which also has some demographic aspects to it. All 3 of those channel into or are considered in the overall vulnerability index, which is this map. So this kind of gives you an overall sense of vulnerability for Anacortes as a whole. And the darker areas of the map tend to be higher vulnerability, lighter areas, less vulnerability. Now, one of the things that came up as we presented this earlier in the process is a real saying, Anacortes is a small community and there's lots of individual pieces on this map. We really want policies that are going to think about the whole community. And we fully understand that and are working on policies that really reflect the entire community and not trying to focus on each specific areas. But what the vulnerability index really is helpful for is identifying how we might need to focus on key areas and integrate or have policies that really direct key improvements or key mitigation strategies in those areas. One of the reasons why the sort of downtown area, the eastern part of Anacortes is popping up is because the combined impacts from sea level rise, but also heat exposure and all these pieces and also the local demographics in that area. So we are developing citywide policies, and I want to set everyone's minds at ease that we're not trying to sort of get so specific based on this map, but the map is a helpful tool for understanding where there is local vulnerability in the community. Any questions about that? The final thing I'll add is that I'm using terms like vulnerable community, and in some of the boards you might see words like overburdened communities. There are several terms that were included in the states. It's called HB 1181, and that was the law that created the climate element requirement, and that law defined several of these terms. On the table here, I have a glossary that the Department of Commerce has put out, which has many of these definitions. And so we are following state guidance in our use of those terms and the requirements to do those. There are minimum requirements set forth by the state for these climate elements. So if you have questions about those terms or why we're using them, or the glossary is a great first part, and then we're happy to talk more. So we use the climate index. Oh, yeah, question. More vulnerable, yeah, in a darker color, yeah. on the map. Okay, so the culmination, the vulnerability index is really the tool to help us visualize the information and the data that we'd gathered across throughout the project and across for the community as a whole. And then we've taken that information and done a vulnerability and risk assessment through team to look at what the vulnerability for each of these hazards is for the Anacortes community as a whole. And this work also considers, I didn't include the slides, but as part of this process, we developed a list of assets for the local community, and we worked with, one piece I didn't mention up front, we have been working with something called the climate team throughout the year. I should have mentioned this up front. Many of them are here tonight. It's a group of combined of staff, but also community members to really help guide the process, make sure our information is really ground truth in the local context. So they have helped all along the way shaped and put input into these to make sure that what the analysis work that we were doing was reflecting Anacortes. So we worked with them to develop a list of assets, and then we've been looking at those assets along the way to understand what the vulnerability is locally. So what this chart kind of shows is that two of the key vulnerability areas for the city of Anacortes are temperature, increased heat, and sea level rise. Now, the chart here has both the impact, but also probability, so the likelihood that it's going to happen, the mitigation difficulty, how easy is it to mitigate the effects, and all of those play into what the overall risk is. So from a temperature standpoint, it's likely that the area is going to be experiencing higher temperatures in the future, and there's significant impacts from that, and some challenges in mitigating it, and so that results in a higher risk score. Similarly to sea level rise, there's, for those who have seen some of the early reports or know some of the sea level rise impacts in other areas, Anacortes doesn't have the broad impacts of sea level rise as some adjacent communities do. But we still are seeing that the probability is high that there's going to be impacts from sea level rise just based on development along those coastal areas. And it's going to be a challenging thing to mitigate over time. So that's why that puts that into the higher category. Before I move on, are there any questions on that? Okay. So for the moderate categories, still impacts, but maybe slightly lesser so, but still important to consider in planning are extreme precipitation, and all the various impacts from that, both changes in seasonal weather, seasonal precipitation, so both drought, but also heavier rain. Water resources, that lack of snowpack, not thinking about snowpack as much locally, but knowing that snowpack is a major factor in the Skagit River as a water resource. So that's where that connection is, and we just connected that to water resource to make that more clear. But understanding the connection the city has, it's vital to the Skagit River, and needing to be thinking about that, which the city is already doing in their water system planning, is really crucial moving forward as well. Wildfires and wildfire smoke also are both in that moderate category. The impact is certainly moderate. There are areas that are high risk. The probability, particularly for a local wildfire, is relatively low. It's not a very common or frequent occurrence, but it does happen, and will be challenging to mitigate. So that's how that ended up more of a moderate. And then finally, landslides. On the lower end, just based on, there are areas that are vulnerable to landslides. That is likely to increase in the future, but fewer what we found in our analysis assets that were directly at risk at that. Low doesn't mean no risk, though, and that's a huge takeaway here, is that it's still something the city needs to be thinking about and considering and planning. But I think this overall chart just gives a sense of where the most challenging things that the city will need to be considering in the future lay, and how that's shaping the focus for goals and policies. Any questions? I know there's a lot of information. Okay, I'm going to invite John Phillips up, who's going to speak now, just the highlights of the greenhouse gas. And John was also heavily involved in this work, so if he has anything to add on the risk, he's welcome to bring that in.
Thank you, Katie. Just a couple notes, and I just want to make sure we emphasize low risk does not mean no risk. See, that kind of rhymes. That's kind of easy to remember. There's still a risk. It's just not as high as the other risks. And also in the mitigation difficulty, one of the things we evaluated is the actions the city was already taking or the region was taking. So we might score that a low risk, for example, on water resources, because the Public Works crew is already looking at the Skagit River and water availability. They're doing studies on what it might be in the future. So we said it's a high risk, really, that you might have difficulty getting water, but they're working on it now and looking at what the future might look like. So we would score that a low risk because there's already actions being taken. But again, low risk does not mean no risk. All right, so we're going to transition. Any more questions about risk, the risk assessment? There's a nice little report up here we wrote. Yes, sir. Well, we were focused a little bit more on the climate side of it, where your hazard mitigation plan will do your earthquake and tsunami. So yes, they are there. We're cognizant of that, but we were kind of in the climate element focused on those things that would happen because of the impacts of climate change. We haven't seen the conclusive evidence yet, but we've heard rumors that earthquakes may be more frequent under climate, but we don't know for sure, right? So we've had that argument in places. But yeah, definitely the hazard mitigation plan and the I'm going to say the appendix, but I forget what they actually call it, where the city of Anacortes has their own kind of thing. We'll have your earthquake, tsunami, current landslides, current things like that. And we'll coordinate with like what are those impacts that should be kind of looked at in the hazard mitigation plan from climate change. And of course, Skagit County is doing the same work right now as well. All right, we're going to move on to the greenhouse gas inventory and how we kind of came up with some of these goals and policies for the greenhouse gas work. So one of the things we did in parallel was looking at the climate impacts was we also went ahead and did a community-wide greenhouse gas inventory to include all these factors. Transportation, building and energy, the ag, forestry, and land use. We'll talk about that because it's kind of cool. Industrial processes and product use. And then, of course, solid waste and wastewater. We also did kind of what we call a consumption inventory. That's what the city of Anacortes, everybody here, consumes. So we wanted to look at that too, because sometimes there's some greenhouse gas mitigation measures that can be taken based on your consumption that are kind of things where we can't control it, but we can definitely educate and say, hey, if you use this product or if you do less of this or more of that, that might have an impact on the greenhouse gas emissions from the city. So you're great. Your average per capita greenhouse gas per person is 13.7 megatons of CO2, and that's right at the state average. So you're not better, you're not worse, you're just right there at your average. Yes, go ahead. No, we don't include the refineries because they're outside of city limits, but Skagit County does. So if you look at their inventory they just completed, the refineries are reflected in there. So yeah, good question. Go kind of a little bit, transportation, of course, what is included in the city of Anacortes is the ferries. And we actually use the ferries that actually leave Anacortes and go to the San Juan Island. So you're kind of taking on that, that burden of those greenhouse gas emissions. Nice thing is the state's looking at reducing the greenhouse gas emissions from the ferry fleet and looking to electrify the fleet. Your agricultural, forestry, and land use, the fact that you have a community forest actually gave you a negative score there, which is a good score, right? It's positive. It's actually taking CO2 out of the atmosphere because you have this healthy forest within your community. We get to count that too. So while we count some bad things, we leave some things out, you know, it kind of comes across as, hey, this is what's going on and here's where we can reflect. So it's a little bit difficult when you start getting to that point of saying, okay, so what else can be done to reduce greenhouse gases by the city of Anacortes within your control and within your city limits? So that's kind of the challenge, and there's a nice graph over on this board over here. Take a really close look at it. We've included all the actions taken by the state and any actions that have been taken by the federal government up to now as part of that inventory and that what we call the wedge graphic, which is this colorful graphic you see over here. Do we have that on the slide too? Okay, cool. So there it is on the slide, but you can walk up and look at that one. The other things left on there are really kind of the gasoline, diesel emissions, and then, of course, natural gas coming into the city and being used. So right now, there isn't a lot of momentum to reduce the use of natural gas, but also gasoline itself, right? We can start looking at alternatives. We had some really good meetings with kind of both the refineries, so we can understand what the product availability was, but also with different industries within the city to say, hey, like, you know, what are the opportunities here where we can reduce greenhouse gases by looking at different fuel sources and different fuel types. Renewable diesel, things like renewable diesel sounds funny. There actually is a renewable diesel. Both Sinclair and Marathon have programs for that. And it's becoming more widely used because the West Coast, including British Columbia, really want to get away from those diesel emissions. So that's kind of a, not necessarily in your control. You can definitely say, hey, we support the use of that. We support reducing the greenhouse gases from the ferries. We support reducing greenhouse gases from diesel fuel. But that's going to take kind of a market driver and kind of a regional look at it to kind of get that down. But it's possible. The other thing is kind of reflected on natural gas. Natural gas is, methane is a much higher emitter of CO2 than CO2 itself. I know that kind of sounds weird, but when we score methane, it actually comes up a lot higher because a lot more CO2 is created from the burning of natural gas. But that being said, there's not a lot of programs out there. Now, on the other hand, Washington is looking at the clean energy standards, reducing the reliance on fossil fuels, including coal, in our electricity grid. Puget Sound Energy has given us a lot of great information on what they're doing. We've included that as what can happen in the future. So the most important line on this whole graph is that black line. So that is what it would take to get to net zero. You want to point to it? Thank you. And then the red line, that's what would happen if we didn't do any of these things and the population kept increasing to what it was within the city of Anacortes. So that's what we're looking at, that area between the red and the black line of what we can reduce and what's already being done to reduce those. So we have to start pulling small policies out that say what can be done and how well will those go. There's lots of policies we could recommend to the city, but we really wanted to score those policies and what's giving you your biggest bang for your buck. Question, Derek in the back. Per capita? That's a great question. I'm going to call my colleague down that did this work and ask her what that would be. That's a good question. I don't know it off the top of my head. I would say 20% would be a nice, good number to kind of use if you want to try to figure it out tonight. But I'll text my colleague and say, hey, what would be the per capita need? That's a good number to have. So thanks for asking that question. I'm sorry I don't have the answer off the top of my head. There's plenty of CO2 to go around. Yeah, there's enough. Oh yeah. Even if we reduce it, I mean, our historic use of the parts per million of historic CO2 in the atmosphere is somewhere around 250, and we were at that until the industrial age. We're now way over 400 parts per million. So we're almost double what it was when we were an agricultural-based community. So there's plenty of CO2 in the atmosphere for the plants, even if we start reducing CO2. Right now, there's just way too much CO2 in the atmosphere. The plants will still thrive, your forests will still thrive, even if we take down this reduction in CO2. There's still going to be too much, honestly. Even if we do everything we can do, there's still going to be too much CO2 in the atmosphere. You're welcome. That was the reduction per capita was a good question. I like that one. We'll figure that out, then you'll all have a goal. And if you're going to be around in 2050, then you can shoot for that goal. Any other questions on the greenhouse gas emissions? That's my last slide. So we do have some targets. We do have some boards up here that talk about different policies we could implement within the city and work with you all, city staff, planning commission, and city council to kind of put those into the comprehensive plan. So in the long run, we'd be looking at what can be actually enacted and how much the city can control. So that's from the greenhouse gas perspective. The city has asked for some interim targets, so kind of that question, what does 10% look like? What does 20% look like? What are the steps we're going to get to so we know we're on track? So you'll have some measures and milestones to look at. And And then, of course, we recommend highly that the city, and the city's doing what they can to partner and coordinate with other regional entities, especially like Washington State Ferries, the refineries, other things that are impacting the CO2 emissions here in Anacortes that are outside of your control. So that's the other thing to think about too. And just remember, everybody else is doing this too, right? It's just not the city. Skagit County is doing it. Whatcom County is doing it. Snohomish County will do it. Island County didn't do a greenhouse gas inventory, but they're definitely working on their resiliency plan and said, oh, we got to drive through Anacortes to get out of here. So we know these things are happening, right? All right, Katie's going to take over and talk about the fund's goals and policies. Thank you.
Thanks, John. So this just really introduces what we're here to talk about tonight, or really just talk with you over the boards. So the boards are sharing tonight reflect some of the emerging priorities from the climate elements. We have a long list of goals and policies, and we didn't want to drown you with a bunch of kind of lists tonight. So we've kind of pulled out, and in some cases combined them to highlight some of the real key priorities that are emerging out of the climate elements related to reducing greenhouse gases and addressing the impacts that we talked about tonight. So that's what we're showcasing here on the boards tonight. It's not everything that's in the climate element. If you really want to see kind of a draft level list, we have some hard copies here. We're asking you to they stay here tonight. We're going to be presenting those to the Planning Commission at the April 9th meeting. So that's when the list will be ready and fully available to the public. But we're happy to share kind of the working list and where we are tonight. But the goals that or the priorities that we're showing on the board tonight really do capture the key things that the climate element is really focused on. And this just shows kind of the one board here. So the activities, you all should have dots. If you don't, there's lots of dots at the front desk. We've given everybody 12, I think. And what we're asking you to do is just review the information on the boards. And I'm just going to go back one slide just to sort of highlight and put a dot kind of in the priority or goal descriptions that you find most compelling, you're most excited to see the city do, you think is most important, however you want to define that. What we're trying to do tonight is really just get an understanding of what feels most, what are the priorities from your standpoint? What do you most want to see the city do in the near term? We've also provided stickies, so you have 12 dots, and I think there's like 24 kind of boards. So we're asking you to make a few choices, but that really does help understand where the priorities are coming from the community. Stickies, however, are unlimited. So you are also welcome to use the stickies wherever and however many you want to on the boards to give us additional feedback or just thoughts and sharing those tonight. And that's not limited to just these boards. You could put those on any of the boards you see here tonight with information. I wanted to also highlight on these kind of priorities boards, we have kind of a summary of the impact. So we have greenhouse gas impact. That means just how effective is the strategy at reducing greenhouse gas emissions, the resilience, how effective it is at increasing resilience. Cost and complexity is a very high level idea of this is a high cost item or will be challenging, or not, maybe not challenging, but will be more complex to, so maybe not a near term action, but could be very effective as a longer term action. Environmental justice relates back to those, some of the minimum requirements for the climate element to not increase impacts for vulnerable or overburdened communities. So there's guidance from Commerce as to what the value from an environmental justice standpoint. So that's what that's measuring. And finally, partner coordination. As John said, Anacortes is not doing this alone. Every community in Washington State is tasked with a similar chart of seeing that net zero emission goal by 2050 and how they're going to get there. And so there's a lot of partner opportunity. So that could be local partners, but it's also regional partners, state partners. So some of them goals we really wanted to sort of suggest that, you know, for folks not to think that the city is undertaking all of this in silo form, that there's really opportunity for partnership. And then your feedback tonight really helps our team and city staff really understand what the local priorities are. I want to quickly touch on next steps, and then we really want to just get dots on boards. Some upcoming Planning Commission meetings. So March 26th, that's next week. We're going to be we'll be presenting Makers and Parametrics, the more detailed version of tonight's kind of summary of the analysis that supports the climate element. So we won't yet be talking about goals and policies. We really will be just getting more detailed on the climate vulnerability report and on the greenhouse gas inventory. And then on April 9th, there'll be a follow-up meeting, also Planning Commission, to present the goals and policies. So that's when those will be available. And also at that meeting, discussing climate or environment and conservation element. And there's a lot of overlap between those two elements. So we've been working closely with Libby on that. And then the 23rd of April is the scheduled hearing for the climate element, so the opportunity for public to make public comment there. And then May 14th, presentation discussion for parks and recreation and open space element and the economic development element. And then the public hearing for those two elements to follow on May 28th. So that's an overview. That information, I'm sure, is, if not, is already on the city's website, will be shortly. So check back planacortes.com. And with that, unless there's any other questions, I'm happy to just transfer over to the open house part. Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, we did try to get at that with both that kind of cost and complexity. It's a big question, and I recognize, and so we recognize that some of these are going to require funding in order for the city to implement. They will require partnerships. So I would say on these evaluations, the cost and complexity line and then that partnership line are both kind of indications of where, you know, there will be need for that. But I think the state has really tasked communities with getting started, and there is funding available to sort of do follow-up planning through the same grant cycle that funded the climate element work. So there is already existing funds at the state level for that, for communities to get started on some of the planning level information. But I think certainly an understanding that further investment is needed. Yeah. 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 The city has been meeting with industry leaders. We had a couple of listening sessions with industry leaders to kind of hear local concerns and share information. And so I would say the city and the port was involved also as a member, and we had industry representation on the climate element, so along with stakeholders from the community. So it was a really community effort and a diverse community of stakeholders that informed the development of the climate element. So I would say they're part of the conversation in terms of engagement with them, but we're not at the stage yet to say specific policies. There's also obviously multi-levels of regulation in place, so I think the City of Anacortes is really focused on what's within the city's levers to address, and I think the priorities that you see on the boards kind of reflect that, yeah. And the last thing I'll leave you with, again, just want to hear from you tonight. Really appreciate everyone coming out. I think, especially when you're looking at greenhouse gas emissions and looking at that chart of like moving over time, there's actions that the city's doing, and the city is really, and communities all across Washington doing it, but a lot of it is also going to be the community of Anacortes in defining how successful those actions are. So the city can make a certain level of investments, but it's also going to take actions across the community in order to be fully successful. So that's really what we're wanting to hear tonight. What is the community most excited about? What do you most want to see? So would love to talk with you more about that. Yeah.
Let me ask you an ideological question here. With city planning and this kind of thing, all the pressure is always more and more housing, more and more housing. You come in and you take down all the trees, you know, and then we plant these little saplings here and there, you know. How much of a factor are trees in the mitigation process versus
I'm a landscape architect by training, so I also adore trees and see their importance. There's a lot that trees can do. Oh, sorry, yeah. I was just saying I'm a landscape architect by training, so adore trees and understand the value they bring. Certainly they play a factor, and as John presented, you see the benefits that you have from that large urban forest is providing some mitigation for local emissions. Trees alone aren't a panacea for carbon emissions or to reduce emissions, so you can't get everything. Yeah, but they're a piece of the puzzle. So I think we do have some policies here around increasing urban tree canopy and ways that the city can look to do that, not only kind of in and around Anacortes Community Forest, but look at where there's a deficit of trees in the community. So we do have some policies around that. So I'd say they're a piece of the puzzle, but certainly there's no magic piece to that. And then if you have more specific questions on like the actual value of trees, John Phillips may be able to speak to more detail, and also we can follow up with other members of the team if you have more specific questions. I'm sorry, I can't tell. Even though I'm a landscape architect, I can't tell you that offhand, but we can follow up with, happy to follow up with information. All right, with that, I'm just going to invite folks. We'll be here, happy to talk, but we'll just invite folks up to just look at boards and provide feedback, and really appreciate it. And I know I see some questions in the room, so happy to take more questions up here.